DCP Player free. Get it now from digital.net.au.
Now the speed IMF3. So now we're going to have Arjun come up and talk to you about the next step in the process. This step.
Where was it?
I know, where was I?
Oh, okay.
Dancing on stage.
Hi. So Annie gave you a very brief introduction of the SMPTE process and where we are with the IMF and the IMP. I'm actually going to talk a little bit more nuts and bolts about generating IMPs or the actual interoperable master packages. And these are the files that actually constitute the actual format. And of course, at Fox, we lovingly call them the parts and pieces. Because if you think about what the IMF really is, and essentially it's a collection of assets: image, audio, closed caption, subtitles, this composition playlist, which is the overall recipe, and the output profile list, all packed together into this collection of files, which we all call, which we're calling an IMP. Well, in reality, what we really want it to be is a combination of multiple assets. The whole idea of IMFs, much like Howard alluded to, was to be able to somehow wrangle this entire version explosion. So we want to be able to address each of these. So we essentially have, for example, we can utilize the French composition playlist and reference the actual French assets, and we can also tie together the main video, which you'll see is being reused in multiple incarnations of the CPL. So I can then go to the English CPL and again reference the same. And the best part is, this is great, we came up with this great concept. We'll also go to attend SMPTE meetings, which we do regularly every 2 weeks, so please do attend, and we'll keep arguing and working this out. So we'll take our time. Well, things changed a little bit at Fox. We basically came out with our studio additional media supply chain, which was primarily building our on-lot asset management and archival system. In addition, we basically had a mandate from the studio where we had to make available all of our video assets for international distribution in not just English, but multiple languages by June 2011. And then, of course, we wanted to make a lot of money with the Netflixes and everybody else, so we wanted to at least help all of our ESD partners with their overall business expansion in multiple areas. Okay, so we have a couple of possible solutions, because now we actually have a business need. We somehow, as technologists, have to basically figure out how we can basically provide that. Well, the simple one, of course, is we can ingest and encode all of our local versions. Everything that happens in territory, much like you saw in Frozen, the example, you could basically have, let's take a guess, maybe 25 languages, so you can have 25 versions, and keep storing each one of those. Well, storage is cheap, right? I mean, so what's a big deal? Well, other problem is we're basically locked to the localized version as well as its aspect ratio. So if somebody in territory had just made a 4:3 PAL, well, how are you going to do a 16:9 HD version of that? No way. Well, so our other option was we can basically generate the localized domestic from the domestic, and then basically just utilize that metadata and then reutilize this over and over again. So then, of course, the questions that come up is, well, this complements the IMF effort, but wait, how do I make the parts and pieces? Nobody inside SMPTE is telling me that. So we're going to go into a little bit of the nuts and bolts of basically how we at Fox have taken since about 2011 about 30,000 assets. And since some of the IMF standard we were at least helping to standardize, we also still wanted to continue making. So we call it our Fox composite asset, but it is very much in tune and line with the IMF piece. And as soon as it's a standard, we'll be able to essentially transfer over. Fundamentally, the difference isn't that difficult, so it's applicable to both our theatrical and episodic content. And also, we have to make a choice in terms of is it current, i.e. in production and in flow right now, or is it catalog? So taking our episodic route, for the catalog, we're basically have the localized content already available in territory. So we actually have to get that back and digitize it and utilize that, as I'll show you in a second, to act as a reference to generate into our system, which we call the International Version Management System, or IVMS. In the case of current, we actually do not make it in territory. We actually get back the localized information as EDLs, utilizing an edit tool our IT group built for us. So we can actually have proxies available in territory for people to actually provide the localized insert information, the language pieces, and then we actually get all of that back as an XML. Similar thing happens on the theatrical side. Once again, I think the big point to note is once we've collected this information, either as a reference or as primarily as metadata, i.e. the XML pieces and the EDL of where it needs to go, it then basically comes back to this IVMS system. And just given that I have only 9 minutes left, we're going to actually focus just on the episodic catalog portion and how we kind of do that as a simple example. So I'm going to try and utilize editorial timeline example. So in the case where we actually do have a localized reference, we go ahead and actually ingest our domestic source. All of our workflow, and that was is all based around capturing our domestic material as well as our inserts in an uncompressed format. We are big proponents, and that's why it kind of tied in really nicely with also the IMF effort in a JPEG 2000 mathematically lossless model. So we capture our domestic source. All of our domestic source is comes along with the text list at the back end, so we capture all of that. We also capture the localized source, but we only capture that in a compressed format. And we basically want to utilize just that as a reference. And the whole idea of basically capturing that is mainly because of regional SNL practices as well as other censorship reasons, we may actually have different runtime for the domestic capture, including commercial formatting and stuff. So what we actually do is, utilizing standard NLE, we actually go ahead and edit the localized version and match up the domestic and the localized frame by frame. So you actually scrap the timeline until you find a change in picture, and then have an editor actually manually move this over. We've experimented with a variety of indexing and a variety of other tools. The problem was we still needed somebody to go back into an editorial system and do it. And if that was the case, let's just do it one time. And it's really fast, working primarily in a compressed domain. And then we basically continued this through the entire process. And we then bring all that back together so that now we have the domestic source basically lining up with the localized source. All of this information, even though I'm kind of showing it to you as we've actually moved it over, is purely done in a metadata standpoint, from a metadata non-destructive standpoint. Okay, so now we need to actually come back and generate the textual information. So in territory, because of subtitle reasons or story points, there may actually be reasons where they may want to provide story points, so we actually add forced text. Similarly, we may actually change the title information on the mains and ends. So we actually come back and recreate the texted information. And once we regenerate that texted information, we then cut it back in. So simple example of retexting is we utilize the domestic backbreak. We take the localized texted reference, and now we have an idea of what was done in territory. So, for example, in this case, we know what they actually did in France. We also utilize the domestic texted reference so that we can follow whatever the show's font style is, as well as the placement. Because a lot of times, if it happens in territory, they may actually put it in any number of locations and utilize any font that they may choose. And then utilizing the domestic textless background, I'm saying that fast. We actually generate a new localized textless clip at the resolution of the domestic uncompressed, but now we also have the actual material that was for territory. We then basically come back and, again, from a purely editorial standpoint, from a CPL, a composition playlist, or a recipe standpoint, basically insert that in. So we basically, look at that. Come on, that was animation. just do a reality makeup check. Once we have the capability now of actually having put the entire rebuilt localized version, well, we can then abstract all of that work that was done into a simple playlist, into a simple recipe which basically indexes where I want to play part A, specifically the domestic source, then jump into the localized insert, then come back to the domestic source. At the same time, it's referencing the localized audio. So, just to tie back to the IMF piece, we now have the domestic source with textless. We have the localized audio that we have for that particular version, all of the localized texted elements that we generated, and this little XML piece that we actually have, which ties them all together. And that's really our first composite asset, or our interoperable master package. So, now we know how to make the parts and pieces. Great. Well, how do we manage them? Because as you can imagine, now we've got a littering of assets. It's hard to really cut and edit in HD or in UHD, especially if you're doing simple editorial tasks, recreate all of this information. So our objective was to primarily be able to provide into our digital vault actual material that we would repurpose over and over again. While for our work in progress, what we call our production SAN on the bottom that you see there, capabilities are basically being able to work with, but then we wanted to have actual linkages. The whole notion of UUIDs, which is the same concept that is kind of carried through from digital cinema into IMF also. Similarly, we needed workflow orchestration, we needed simple things like NLE integration. We didn't want to go out and start developing a whole new editorial platform for clipping and things like that. So in our case, we actually use Final Cut Pro, and that way we can have very easy integration with that. At the same time, we also wanted to recreate all of these graphics and texted elements. Well, there are a lot of commercial packages out there, people who are trained in that. Why train somebody with a brand new tool? So, we use a standard NLE, and of course, since it's a standard NLE, it doesn't speak a standard language. So we basically have to wrap it around with an actual messaging layer, message transfer layer, utilized a product from Marquis Broadcast called Medway, but then we actually added a bunch of customization, which we affectionately call ED. So we take ED, and ED basically allows for essentially a state machine. So we know in what state, because we also have this work in progress database. And then we actually layered that over an orchestration layer. So there are clearly steps that we have to follow as part of our workflow. We need to ingest, we need to edit, we need to graphic text, and all of that needs to kind of follow through a proper orchestration, especially when you have a group of, on a production floor, you have a group of people all working together. So we then basically utilize our asset management system so that we can basically take material through on the uncompressed side, call our transcode farm, make the proxies, register them in, put them into the editor, and then similarly do the same thing with the localizer you saw with the previous process. And then you kind of go through that process. And then as you walk through, you're actually creating step 4 where the graphics are done, step 5 where you'll put all that together, and at the end of it, you're coming out with the domestic source, this little XML piece, which actually can reference everything, and much like you saw, all the other texted pieces. So, okay, so when we all put it all together, we have one standard domestic video, we have all of our different languages and each of their inserts. We have all of our CPL, this little XML piece that kind of ties them all together for their different versions. And what we'd like to do is magically transcode them and make all of these great deliverables. Magically transcode. Wow. Well, that's where the OPL comes in. And a big need for the OPL was we needed to be able to specify all of the transcode and what we want to actually deliver and make separate from the program specifications. Otherwise, you're basically combining both of those together. So you have now a recipe of putting it together as well as a recipe of how to make it, which means you're back into version management for the French version versus the French version for Netflix, iTunes, Amazon, and anybody else. So that is the big separation between the CPL and the OPL. And we basically wanted to extend that. We wanted to make it XML, so extensible set of instructions, and then also operate on one CPL. So the whole idea was we also wanted to make it so that we can actually control the sequencing. I'm not running out of time. So we can basically add processes as we go on. So the first piece that we're in drafting with SMPTE, we have the capability of doing simple image operations, scaling, fill, crop, as well as audio muxing and routing. So you can basically have 5 channels and figure out if it needs to go to channel 1, channel 2, and then we can basically think about growing this. That's OPL. So if you have any questions, we can hold it later. Otherwise, please join SMPTE, join 35PM50, join CPL, OPL, or email me. Thank you.